Although previous studies reported functional plastic brain changes in acupuncturists, and this means that while performing acupuncture, you could see specific regions getting activated in the brain of acupuncturists, whether or not structural plastic changes occurred in acupuncturists remained elusive. That is, until a 2013 study from the School of Life Sciences and Technology in Xidian University in China. The study revealed that actual structural changes in the brain of acupuncturists corresponded to years in practice. Welcome to On the Pulse, where we take a deep dive into the integrative solutions in the field of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Rambert. Brain plasticity has fascinated researchers for decades, and imaging studies provide compelling evidence that enhanced use of a body part, as in athletes or dancers or cognitive functions, think of meditators, result in structural plastic changes in the central nervous system. What this means is that performing a task with intention, with skill, over numerous years results in actual structural changes in the brain. And training is a key factor that influences neuroplasticity. In other words, spending time focusing on a task creates long-term changes in the brain. You can think of these as grooves, neural grooves that create these long-term pathways in the brain and actually change the structure of the brain. Acupuncturists are a great model to study tactile, motor, and emotional regulation plasticity, since they receive intensive medical training and their behavioral expertise is refined over long-term clinical practice. The 2013 study out of Xidian University in China compared a group of 22 professional acupuncturists with 22 non-acupuncturists. The researchers first assessed what they called behavioral expertise, which you can think of as emotional regulation proficiency. They found that acupuncturists had greater behavioral expertise and better tactile motor skills when compared to non-acupuncturists. The researchers used the voxel-based morphometry technique, VBM for short, which is a neuroimaging technique that investigates focal differences in brain anatomy. The core processes of VBM is basically segmenting the brain into gray matter, white matter, and cerebrospinal fluid. This is where we get to assess structural changes in the brain. Researchers found larger volume of gray matter in areas of the somatosensory cortex corresponding to the hand. So what this indicates is that more brain infrastructure is allocated to sensory and motor control of the hand, which makes sense for acupuncturists. The researchers suggest that larger contralateral representations in the primary somatosensory cortex of the right hand may support the acupuncturist's extraordinary ability in perceiving subtle tactile information, eventually facilitating their tactile discrimination ability. And this corresponds to the acupuncturists scoring higher in fine motor skills when they were assessed compared to the non-acupuncturists. In addition, acupuncturists had greater gray matter in certain regions of the cerebellum, and structural changes in this region fit particularly well with the well-established cerebellar involvement in unilateral finger movement control. The researchers hypothesized that more gray matter in this area indicates the higher fine motor skills, and interestingly enough, this enhanced brain structure may also facilitate learning and retention of those fine motor skills. So basically, the more you use it, the more real estate the brain dedicates to the skill, which then results in improved performance of that skill. Let's now take a look at the mechanisms that underlie these greater fine motor skills. Acupuncture processes rely primarily on the acupuncturist's tactile feedback to manipulate the needle to elicit stimulation of the underlying neurovascular bundles, and sensitivity to feedback from the patient's body is critical to this process. Some areas may even be particularly sensitive or require particularly honed motor skills such as threading needles along the skull, areas around the canthus, the bottom of the feet, etc. Although this process seems automatic for professional acupuncturists, it can be decomposed into several interacting components in sensorimotor and cognitive domains. We're going to take a look at 4 of those domains. Number 1, exceptional tactile discrimination ability, which enable the acupuncture practitioners to distinguish subtle, dynamic changes of manipulation transmitted through fine needles, because a patient's concurrent physical status and synchronous bodily responses to each round of needling manipulation is constantly changing. Number 2, the ability to make precise adjustments and promptly execute precise movements. Number 3, fine or dexterous motor skills to manipulating the fingers. Number 4, emotion regulation proficiency. And this is indispensable because acupuncture could induce empathic pain in acupuncturists, and repeated exposure to such situations could naturally induce negative emotions or personal distress. So, how does this greater capacity for emotional regulation look like in the brain of acupuncturists? Acupuncturists' daily clinical practice naturally leads to empathic pain, which would cause a negative emotional response such as unpleasantness or distress. So the researchers hypothesized that there must be a certain central mediating mechanism which helps them cope with the adverse daily events and prevents negative emotions from impairing the ability to heal or be of assistance. Anecdotally, one of the things that I've noticed in myself, my peers, and our mentors is a great empathic quality. But this is combined with a strong capacity to mediate this empathy in order to be clinically effective. In terms of brain findings, researchers found more gray matter in the ventral anterior cingulate cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, these are both areas that are involved in complex cognitive processes such as emotional regulation and empathy. Specifically, these regions are associated with suppressing or reappraising negative emotional stimuli, and with suppressing the influence of negative emotion stimuli on subsequent behavior. Also, a recent report stated that increased gray matter volume in these regions were associated with enhanced emotion regulation control performance after long-term meditation training. In contrast, pathological data demonstrated the dysfunction in emotion regulation was largely associated with decreased gray matter volume in these regions. Taken together, the authors suggest that larger gray matter volume in the ventral anterior cingulate cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex are highly likely to be associated with the acupuncturist's emotion regulation expertise. However, and this is interesting to note, there was no correlation between duration of acupuncture practice and gray matter volume in those brain areas. Indeed, emotion regulation is a higher order cognitive function, and it is possible that the corresponding brain structures do not develop over the same time frame as sensorimotor functions. You will remember that gray matter volume in the sensorimotor cortex relating to fine motor skills corresponded with years of acupuncture practice. Perhaps the capacity for emotional regulation and empathy predated the acupuncture profession. Or perhaps acupuncturists are drawn to the profession due to a unique capacity for both deep empathy and emotional self-regulation.